Trash. The word, a single venomous syllable, was spat from the lips of a man whose skin was tanned by decades of yacht deck sun. It wasn't shouted. It was worse. It was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone swatting a fly, a pronouncement of worthlessness meant to be as final as a gavel strike. It sliced through the clinking of champagne flutes and the low hum of entitled chatter, and a sudden, sharp silence fell over the sprawling patio. The guests, a collection of old money and new ambition, froze. Their eyes, like a pack turning on the weakest member, swiveled to the woman who was its target. She stood alone near the edge of the flagstone terrace, a figure in a simple, unadorned emerald green dress, her back to the fiery spectacle of the Maine sunset painting the Atlantic. She didn't flinch. She didn't even turn. And in that stillness, a universe of questions began to bloom. Who was she? How did she get here? And why, in the face of such a brutal dismissal, did she seem utterly, terrifyingly unmoved? Before we dive into the wreckage that this one word caused, I have to ask, where are you watching this from right now? Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. Let us know you're here. And if you believe that a person's worth isn't determined by their bank account or their last name, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to tell stories like this, stories that need to be heard. Now, let's get back to that island. Her name was Ava Moreno, though no one here knew it. She was 38 years old, and her stillness wasn't an act of defiance. It was a fortress built brick by brick from a lifetime of similar moments. The waves crashed against the granite cliffs below, a steady percussive rhythm that seemed to ignore the ugliness of the human drama playing out above. The air, crisp with the coming of a New England autumn, smelled of salt and pine, a scent of permanence that stood in stark contrast to the fleeting, fragile egos on display. Whispers erupted like wildfire in dry grass. Guests huddled together, their voices masked behind manicured hands. They dissected her. The dress, simple, elegant, but not a brand they recognized. Her hair, pulled back in a severe, functional knot, not a strand out of place. Her face, calm, her expression unreadable. To them, her very simplicity was an indictment, a glaring admission that she did not belong in their world of curated excess. The man who had spoken, Alistair Finch, the patriarch of the family who owned this private island they called Osprey's Rest, tapped a heavy gold signet ring against his crystal glass. It was a signal. From the shadows near a massive stone fireplace, two men in crisp, white security uniforms detached themselves. Their movements were slow, deliberate, the practiced gait of men paid to remove problems quietly. They began to walk toward her, their polished black shoes making no sound on the expensive stone. Ava let her gaze drift past them, out to the horizon where the last sliver of sun bled into the deep purple of the ocean. It was in this stillness that she found her power. It was an anchor dropped deep into a part of her soul that no storm, no insult, no amount of inherited wealth could ever touch. For a breathless moment, the world seemed to hold its collective breath. Then, the poison began to seep back in. She must have come over with the catering staff. A woman with diamonds dripping from her ears whispered to her companion. "Wrong party, sweetheart. The help eats in the back," another man chuckled, his voice thick with scotch and condescension. "I'll handle this," a younger voice, Alistair's son, declared, with an inherited arrogance he hadn't earned. The family let out a series of short, brittle laughs. It wasn't the sound of humor. It was the sound of a pack reinforcing its own dominance. And yet, Ava did not argue. She did not plead. She did not defend. She simply stood where the manicured terrace met the wild, untamed view, her green dress a slash of vibrant life against the fading light. Her silence was a mirror, and in it their ugliness was reflected back at them, magnified. It was a silence she had perfected over years of enduring the same judgment, the same dismissal, in 1,000 different forms. She remembered being 22, standing in the marble lobby of a 5-star hotel in Charlotte, North Carolina. She'd saved for 6 months to take her parents there for their anniversary. While she waited for them to arrive, the front desk manager had approached her, his eyes raking over her department store dress. "Guests only in the lobby," he'd said, his voice a low, humiliating drawl. He'd looked at her ID, smirked, and added, "People who stay here don't look like you." He had security escort her onto the street just as her parents' taxi pulled up, the shame burning a brand on her soul. She remembered being 29 in a sterile bank manager's office in Boston. She'd been trying to secure a seed loan for her first tech startup. The manager, a man named Henderson, had looked at her meticulously prepared business plan, then at her and frozen her personal accounts on the spot. "A woman with your background doesn't just come into this kind of money," he'd insinuated, demanding paperwork and proof that went far beyond legal requirements. He was searching for a crime because her success didn't fit his worldview. Again and again, the same tone, the same assumption of her insignificance. And now, here she was again, on an island she was just hours away from owning. Phones began to emerge from designer pockets and handbags. A young woman, maybe 20, in a cream-colored cashmere wrap, whispered urgently to her friend, "Why are they doing this to her? She hasn't done a single thing." Her friend, a young man with more bravado than sense, hit record anyway. The small red light on his phone glowed in the twilight, a steady, unblinking witness. Alistair Finch's voice rose, sharp and cracking like broken glass. "Get her out of here. She will not be an embarrassment to this family." But the only embarrassment that night was about to be his. The only legacy about to be cemented was one of public disgrace. The two guards, their white linen shirts stretched taut across broad, formidable shoulders, closed the distance. The setting sun still clung to their tanned skin, giving them an almost ethereal glow. Angels of expulsion. Their footsteps thudded against the stone, a slow, methodical rhythm, each step a tick of a clock counting down to a confrontation they were utterly unprepared for. Alistair didn't spare them a second glance. He didn't need to. In his world, his orders were absolute. His will, law. The guests shifted. A collective, uneasy rustle of silk and wool. Champagne glasses were lowered. The manufactured laughter died. One woman, her face a mask of concern, whispered, "She doesn't look like staff. Look at the way she holds herself." Another man, older, with a cynical curl to his lip, chuckled low. "Doesn't matter," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "She goes." The unspoken laws of this island, the rigid hierarchy of wealth and bloodline, were being enforced. And tonight, they were pressing down with their full weight on the woman in the emerald green dress. The guards stopped, mere inches from her. The taller of the two extended a hand, palm held outward, the universal gesture for stop and go. It was a gesture meant to halt, to remove, to erase. "Ma'am," he said, his voice not harsh, but freighted with a finality that was somehow worse. It was a practiced tone, honed to neutralize any argument before it could begin. "You need to come with us." Ava didn't move. Not a shoulder, not a hand. Her gaze remained locked on the horizon, where the sea and sky had melted into a single bruised twilight. The silence around her grew thick, heavy, charged with a tension that was becoming unbearable. Alistair leaned on an ornate, silver-headed cane, a faint, smug smile playing on his lips. He decided to twist the knife. "This is a private island, you see," he announced, his voice carrying across the patio. "A sanctuary. People pay millions for the privilege of being here, for the sand beneath their feet. They either buy their way in, or they stay out." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over her simple dress. "And you," he let the words hang, heavy and sharp with poison, "you will never, ever be able to afford this kind of sand." Laughter erupted from a small, tight knot of Finch family members behind him, short, brittle bursts of sound that sprang not from genuine humor, but from the absolute certainty that their position was unassailable. But a challenge was already brewing in the silent corners of the gathering. The young man with the sun-drenched hair, who had been whispering with his friend now, had his phone propped discreetly on his lap, its lens aimed directly at the unfolding drama. His screen reflected Ava's face, impassive, unbroken, serene. As the shadow of the guard fell over her, he murmured to his companion, "They have no idea. They literally have no idea who they're talking to." The second guard, growing impatient, reached for her elbow. It was a gesture of ownership, of control. And that was when Ava Moreno finally moved. It wasn't a flinch. It wasn't resistance. It was a single, deliberate step backward. A small movement that had the seismic effect of shifting the entire focus of the scene. It wasn't she who was being cornered anymore. It was they, the guards, the family, who were suddenly under a spotlight of their own making. Her dress caught the breeze from the ocean, the emerald fabric seeming to glow against the deep indigo of the coming night. She was impossible to mistake, impossible to ignore. A new wave of murmurs rose from the guests. A woman in a formidable pearl necklace frowned, her brow furrowed. "She doesn't look afraid," she observed to her husband. Alistair scoffed, louder this time, performing for the circle of onlookers. "That's not fearlessness, that's arrogance, the kind of cheap arrogance that ends with security escorting you off my island." The young woman in the cashmere wrap, the one who had questioned the family's actions earlier, found her voice again. It trembled, but it was clear, and carried across the patio. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Alistair's head snapped toward her, his eyes flashing with fury. His tone sharpened into a razor's edge. "Mind yourself, Chloe. You are a guest here because we allow it. Do not for a second confuse our courtesy with your equality." The words dropped the temperature of the evening by 10 degrees. A chill that had nothing to do with the ocean breeze settled over the crowd. Even the guards hesitated, their eyes flicking from the furious patriarch to the silent woman they had been ordered to remove. She remained silent. But her silence wasn't weakness. It was weight. It was the accumulated weight of every insult, every dismissal, every door slammed in her face. It was the weight of a resilience forged in the fires of their condescension. And though the guards, Alistair, and his whole entitled clan didn't know it yet, they were just seconds away from stepping into a moment of history they could never, ever undo. The hesitation was brief. The taller guard, his jaw set, squared his shoulders. His hand hovered just above her arm, a shadow of intent. Alistair's voice cut through the air like a bullwhip. "Do it! Remove her! Now!" The order cracked through the crowd, and with it came a rustle of renewed confidence from the Finch family's inner circle. A cousin, a woman with a perpetually bored expression, smirked over the rim of her wine glass. "Finally," she drawled. "I thought she'd never get the hint." A man in a navy blazer standing beside her chuckled. "Probably slipped in on the staff ferry. Happens all the time." The laughter was jagged, mean-spirited, the kind of sound designed to corner and diminish a person into non-existence. But Ava didn't bend. The shorter guard stepped closer, his voice pitched low, as if he were trying to rehearse a shred of empathy he didn't feel. "Ma'am, please don't make this difficult. We can do this quietly." The emerald dress shifted as she took a slow, deep breath. She didn't grant him an answer, and her continued silence cut deeper than any shouted defiance ever could. Around the infinity pool, conversations sputtered back to life, not as a sign of celebration, but as a desperate attempt to ignore the raw, uncomfortable theater of cruelty playing out. But they were all still watching. "Who is she?" someone whispered. "Why doesn't she fight back?" another asked. The questions built a tension, a focus that no one, especially not the Finches, wanted to name. Then a new voice entered the fray. It was older, sharper, and dripped with generations of unearned authority. Eleanor Finch, the matriarch, stepped forward. Diamonds flashed like cold fire on her wrist, and her presence was heavy, practiced, a masterclass in command. "I don't know what story you concocted to get onto this island," she said, her eyes boring into Ava. "And frankly, I don't care. This is not your place. Take her away before she embarrasses herself any further." A murmur of approval rippled through the guests closest to the family. Eleanor's tone wasn't just about protecting the family name. It was about policy. It was dismissal as a core value, an ethos carved into her very bones. For the first time all evening, Ava Moreno lifted her eyes from the distant horizon. She let them settle on Eleanor Finch. She said not a single word, but her look, steady and appraising, landed with the weight of a verdict waiting to be read. Eleanor's lips tightened into a thin, bloodless line. She felt the silent judgment and recoiled from it. She turned to the guards, her voice sharper. "You heard me. Escort her out." One guard reached for her arm again, his resolve hardened by the matriarch's command. But just as his fingers were about to make contact, another voice broke through, this one from the crowd. It was a young man, not family, not staff, just a guest who had found a spine. "Hold on a second," he said, courage leaking past his fear. "She hasn't done anything. Why are you treating her like this?" Heads swiveled in his direction. His phone was raised now, no longer hidden. The red recording light was blinking, a tiny, insistent beacon of witness. Alistair's jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. "Turn that off. This is private property." The young man, Liam, didn't lower his phone. "So is a person's dignity," he retorted, his voice cracking but the words landing with the force of a physical blow. "You don't get to trespass on that." A few other guests shifted uneasily. More phones began to slip out of pockets. Camera apps opened quietly. The tide of opinion was turning, not yet a wave strong enough to stop the guards, but a current, a powerful undertow that was beginning to mark every second, every action, for a future accounting. The shorter guard glanced at the growing constellation of glowing screens. "Sir, maybe," he started, his voice trailing off. "Do your job," Alistair snapped, his face turning a blotchy red. The taller guard, caught between a direct order and the palpable shift in the room, made his choice. He lunged, his hand grabbing for her wrist. Gasps erupted across the deck. A champagne flute, forgotten in a shocked hand, shattered against the stone floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence. She didn't resist. She didn't pull away. She simply drew herself up, standing even taller, her silence radiating a power that was louder than any plea, any scream. And in that silence, the raw, naked cruelty of Alistair's command became visible to everyone. The patriarch believed this was the end of a minor, annoying interruption. What he couldn't see, what he was pathologically incapable of seeing, was that it was the beginning of his own spectacular undoing. The guard's fingers were a breath away from closing around her wrist. But she didn't recoil. She stood there, as if she were carved from the same granite as the cliffs below, letting the moment hang in the thick, salt-laced air. Then she spoke. Her first words of the entire evening. The question wasn't shouted. It was steady, almost soft, yet it sliced through the hushed conversations and the sound of the surf with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Is this," she asked, her eyes meeting Alistair's, "really how you want to be remembered?" The question landed with an almost physical force. The guard froze, his hand hovering, his grip loosening before it had even fully formed. Alistair Finch scoffed, trying to force a brittle laugh that fooled no one. Empty words from an uninvited guest. "Don't listen to her. She's wasting our time." But time was no longer his to command. The woman in the emerald dress, Ava, lowered her gaze to the guard's hand, still suspended in the air near her. Calmly, she took another small step back, reclaiming her space, a quiet act of sovereignty. Her chin lifted, and her voice, still even, addressed the guard directly. "You're just following orders. I understand that. But I want you to remember this exact moment, because tonight is not going to be erased." The murmurs swelled again. Guests weren't whispering behind their hands anymore. They were leaning in, listening intently, their fear of the Finch family's power being slowly eclipsed by their raw curiosity. Eleanor, the matriarch, bristled, her diamonds catching the flickering torchlight. "Enough of this performance. You've made a spectacle of yourself. Now leave with what little dignity you have left." Ava's silence was her answer, louder and more profound than any retort she could have formulated. She folded her hands loosely in front of her, the emerald fabric of her dress cascading around her like a banner of some unseen kingdom. She didn't push. She didn't argue. She simply remained, and that stillness, that absolute refusal to be baited into their drama, unsettled them more than the most violent defiance ever could. The young woman in the cashmere wrap, Chloe, whispered to the man beside her, "She's not scared. Look at her. Why isn't she scared?" The man, Liam, shook his head slowly, his eyes fixed on the solitary figure holding the line without moving a single inch. Alistair stepped forward, his cane tapping an agitated rhythm against the stone deck. Frustration was sharpening his voice, making it shrill. "You think this is strength? It's arrogance, and arrogance on my island doesn't last long." But there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed him. It wasn't the sound of authority. It was the sound of unease. The memory of the bank lobby flooded back to Ava. The manager, Henderson, slamming her meticulously organized documents onto his polished mahogany desk, his voice rising as he demanded proof she had no legal obligation to provide. She had stayed silent then, too. A deep, unnerving silence that had so unsettled him that he'd called for security. A move of pure intimidation he never should have made. She had walked out of that bank that day feeling the sting of humiliation. But she never forgot the tremor in his voice when she refused to rise to his bait. He had expected a fight, a plea, tears. He had not expected the unyielding force of her quiet dignity. Now, on this wind-swept island, she watched that same tremor reappear in Alistair Finch's clenched jaw, in Eleanor's narrowing eyes, in the guard's faltering grip on his own certainty. The phones continued to rise. The soft glow of their screens illuminated the encroaching twilight like a field of digital fireflies. Someone whispered, his voice carrying in the charged air, "She's making them look like monsters just by standing there." And she was. Alistair slammed his cane once against the deck, a loud crack that made several people jump. "End this!" he barked. But the command felt smaller now, weaker, like a wave crashing too late against rocks that had stood for millennia. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. Her calm had become the center of gravity for the entire evening, and every insult, every threat they hurled at her only seemed to circle back, boomerangs of their own making, destined to hit them with devastating force. In the profound stillness of that moment, the crowd began to realize something that the Finch family, blinded by their own privilege, could not yet see. She wasn't out of place on this island. She was the only one who was truly grounded here. What happens when an immovable object meets a pathetic force? That's the question on everyone's mind right now, and I want to know what you think. Who is this woman? What is her secret? Drop your theories in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe because the answer is coming, and trust me, you do not want to miss it. The voice that cut through the tension next was shaky, but resolute. I'm filming this. It came from near a set of crackling tiki torches, where a young guest, barely out of college by the look of him, held his phone up high. The red recording light blinked like a tiny, insistent siren in the deepening darkness. He whispered to the person beside him, his voice filled with a mixture of fear and conviction. "They can't get away with this. Not anymore." Alistair spun around, his face a mask of rage. "Put that phone down. This is a private event. You're trespassing with that camera." The young man, emboldened, didn't flinch. "No, sir," he said, his voice gaining strength. "She's the one being trespassed against." A collective gasp fluttered across the gathering. A ripple of courage, contagious and powerful, moved with it. Other phones were lifted, some discreetly from the hip, others held up boldly, defiantly. The glow of their screens illuminated the tanned, shocked faces of the Finch family's inner circle, catching the flicker of unease that was now turning into outright panic. Eleanor stepped forward, her tone sharpening like crystal snapping in the cold. "Shut those off now, every single one of you, or you will all regret being invited here." But the threat had lost its bite. A middle-aged woman standing near the deserted buffet muttered, "What are we even watching right now? She's done nothing." Another guest, a father holding his young daughter's hand, pulled out his own phone, angling it low but keeping it steady. Ava, the woman in the emerald dress, didn't look at the phones. Her eyes scanned the faces in the crowd, her expression changing for the first time, softening into something that looked like a quiet appeal. Then she spoke, her voice low, calm, and deliberate, yet carrying to every corner of the patio. "Justice doesn't need a lens," she said. "It needs witnesses. Speak if you know what you are seeing is wrong." Her words landed like sparks on dry tinder. The young guest, Liam, lowered his phone just a fraction, but his voice carried further this time. "She hasn't raised her voice. She hasn't broken a single rule, and yet you're treating her like a criminal." A murmur of agreement followed. Someone clapped. It was a single, awkward sound. Too early, but it shattered the spell of fear. Alistair's hand was visibly trembling on his cane. He raised his voice, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to reclaim the ground that was slipping from beneath his feet, like sand in an hourglass. "This is our island, our rules. If you question them, you question us." The young woman in the cashmere wrap, Chloe, who had spoken up earlier, stepped out from the crowd. Her voice still wavered, but she stood her ground. "Then maybe," she said, her words piercing the air, "your rules are wrong." The air thickened, became electric. Her words weren't loud, but they struck deeper than any shout could have. Eleanor turned on her, her face contorted with fury. "You will regret speaking out of turn, little girl." But more guests began to shift. Small movements at first. A straightening of shoulders, a hardening of eyes, a quiet turning away from the Finches and toward Ava. The balance of the entire evening had tilted. The guards, once so confident in their purpose, now looked trapped between two opposing commands: obey the family who signed their paychecks or acknowledge the moral authority of the crowd. One whispered to the other, his voice barely audible, "This doesn't feel right, man." Ava stood unmoved, her green dress brushing against the evening wind, her silence pulling the focus, the power, back to her like gravity. She didn't need to argue her case anymore. Others were starting to do it for her. And for the very first time, the Finch family began to realize that the narrative was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to the room. It belonged to the dozens of tiny, blinking red lights that were now pointed directly at them. The air cracked as Alistair's brother, a man named Julian, with a face softened by a life without consequence, stepped forward. His blazer was crisp, his confidence more obnoxious than his brother's. He lifted a manicured finger and pointed it at Ava. "Enough of this little charade. You don't have the money, you don't have the pedigree, and you certainly don't have an invitation. Guards, end this now. She's wasting our air." The command was blunt, unashamed, and designed to wound. It wasn't just dismissal, it was an attempt at erasure. One guard nodded, his jaw tightening, preparing to finally follow through. But Ava didn't even blink. Her gaze remained fixed on Julian, the man who had just stripped her existence down to a mere transaction of worth. "You think wealth is your birthright," she said, her voice still quiet. Yet every person on that patio heard every single word. "But dignity isn't yours to deny anyone." The crowd inhaled as one. The words weren't shouted, but they sliced through the arrogance like a razor. Eleanor barked a laugh, a sound as brittle and sharp as shattering glass. "Dignity? Look at you. No jewels, no title, just a cheap dress and a whole lot of defiance. That's not power, sweetheart. That's desperation." A few family members chuckled, emboldened by their mother's venom. One muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "She probably came on the catering boat." Another added, "Maybe she's hoping to find a rich husband." The cruelty, now naked and unmasked, stung the night air. Guests shifted uncomfortably. A man near the bar whispered to his wife, "This isn't a party anymore. This is a public humiliation." Alistair, sensing a chance to regain control, seized the moment, raising his voice to a roar. "Security! Remove her now!" One guard took a determined step forward, his hand closing into a fist. But then, another sound cut through the tension. Applause. It was soft at first, then firmer. It came from Chloe, the young woman in the cashmere wrap. Her hands were trembling, but she was clapping anyway. "She hasn't done anything wrong, and you all know it," she cried out. Gasps turned into more murmurs. More guests began to clap, a hesitant, fragmented applause. But it was enough. It was enough to fracture the absolute certainty of the Finch family's grip on the evening. Julian sneered. "Oh, so now you're all her defenders? Do you even know who she is? She's a nobody, a fraud pretending to have class." And that's when Ava finally turned, facing the crowd of witnesses instead of her accusers. Her voice remained calm, steady, and devastatingly logical. "You've heard their words. You've seen their actions." She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the faces looking back at her. "Now you tell me, who here looks like the fraud?" The question hung in the heavy silence that followed. Phones tilted higher, camera lenses zoomed closer. Guests exchanged looks, their discomfort hardening into a dawning recognition. Eleanor's diamond bracelet caught the torchlight as she raised her hand dramatically, like a queen ordering an execution. "This ends now. Throw her off this island before the rest of you forget your place." But it was too late. The room had already shifted. The crowd was no longer a passive audience. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They were participants. And their judgment was forming, right there in the open, salt-laced air. And through it all, the woman in the emerald green dress stood still, as calm as stone, watching the Finch family's fragile empire of arrogance crumble, one word, one clap, one recording at a time. The shorter guard's patience finally snapped. His hand darted forward, not for her arm this time, but for the simple glass of water she held. His fingers clamped around the stem. With a vicious jerk, he yanked it from her hand and flung it into the sand, as if her very touch had contaminated it. The water splashed dark against the pale beach, and the sound of the thin crystal shattering against a rock rang out like a verdict. A collective gasp burst across the gathering. A woman near the bar covered her mouth in horror. Someone whispered, his voice trembling with shock, "They just ripped it from her hand." Alistair's voice followed, harsher now, layered with a sickening triumph. "Escort her off this island before she disgraces herself further." The second guard, emboldened by the act of aggression, reached for her arm again. This time his grip closed, tight and bruising, tugging her as if she were a common trespasser caught red-handed. The movement was forceful, and her emerald dress shifted, the fabric snapping in the wind. From behind them, a family cousin sneered, her tone dripping with venom. "She probably did come in on the staff boat. Look at her. No jewelry, no title, just pretending to belong." The words carried like poison on the wind. Murmurs spread, some guests agreeing, others recoiling in disgust. The cruelty was no longer hidden behind veiled whispers. It was broadcast, open, and proud. And yet she did not fight. She didn't jerk her arm free. She let it hang, almost limp, in the guard's grip. Her posture remained impossibly, unnervingly composed. Her eyes lifted, scanning the crowd that had just witnessed this gross escalation. Her gaze was calm, but sharp, as if she were silently recording each insult, each act of humiliation, for a reckoning that was yet to come. Chloe, the sundress woman, trembled, then raised her voice, shouting now, "Stop it! She hasn't hurt anyone." Her words cracked, but they carried. "You're humiliating her for nothing." Alistair wheeled on her, his face purple with rage. "Stay out of this, girl. This family decides who belongs here." Chloe's voice rose higher, steadier now, fueled by righteous anger. "Then maybe the family is wrong." The ripple of shock that followed was louder than any music the DJ could have played. All the while, the guard tightened his hold, tugging her once more toward the edge of the patio. The emerald dress caught the firelight, a flag of defiance in a losing battle. Her silence was iron, and in that silence, a memory rose, unbidden and sharp. 16 years old, Charlotte, North Carolina. A different guard, a different lobby, but the same suffocating shame. She had been told to leave while waiting for her parents, told she didn't belong. That shame had burned itself into her bones. But it hadn't broken her. It had built her. Now here, on this island, with the sand beneath her feet, and 100 pairs of eyes watching, the same humiliation rose to meet her. But she was no longer a powerless teenager. She looked at the guard holding her arm, and her voice was perfectly even. "Touch me again," she said, the words quiet but laced with steel, "and you will answer for it in ways you cannot possibly understand." The words weren't loud, but they cracked the air around them. The guard hesitated, his grip faltering for a split second. Alistair barked, "Ignore her! Remove her!" But the command rang hollow. The crowd wasn't blind anymore. They had seen the drink snatched away. They had seen the arm grabbed. They had heard the words hurled like stones. And slowly, inevitably, the phones lifted higher, their screens glowing brighter in the gathering dark. The Finch family thought they were erasing her. Instead, they were etching their own downfall into the permanent, unforgiving memory of the internet. Ava moved for the first time with deliberate intention. Calmly, she slid her free hand into a hidden pocket in her dress. She drew out a slim, featureless phone. There was no rush, no panic in her movements. She tapped the screen once, pressed it to her ear, and her voice, though quiet, carried with perfect clarity to every single person on the patio. "Activate acquisition protocol, now." The words didn't shout. They detonated. The guard who still held her arm let his grip go slack. Eleanor Finch stiffened, her diamonds clinking against her wrist as if even they could feel the seismic shift in power. Alistair barked out a laugh, hollow and forced. "Acquisition protocol? Is that your pathetic way of begging for attention?" From the speaker of her phone, another voice emerged. It was brisk, efficient, and utterly unquestioning. "Confirmed, Ms. Moreno. Contracts are ready. Ownership transfer can be executed on your command." Gasps rippled across the deck. Heads turned. Eyes widened. Someone whispered, "Contracts? Ownership of what?" Alistair's laugh died in his throat. "You expect us to believe this nonsense? She's an actress, a fraud." But a seed of doubt, cold and terrifying, had been planted. The guests glanced at one another, their phones still raised, capturing the precise historic moment when absolute arrogance collided with undeniable fact. Ava lowered her phone slightly, her eyes not on the family, but on the crowd. "You asked who I am," she said, her voice resonating with a newfound power. "You mocked my dress. You questioned my presence. But none of you asked the only question that truly matters." She paused. "Why I didn't resist." Her words hung in the air like smoke. Chloe's hand trembled against her chest. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice carrying because the night had fallen so utterly quiet. Ava Moreno met her gaze. "Because you don't fight to enter a place that is already yours." The crowd erupted in a low thunder of whispers. A man near the pool nearly dropped his glass. "She's the buyer," he muttered, stunned. "The anonymous buyer from the journal article? She's the one." Eleanor shook her head violently, her perfectly coiffed hair coming undone. "Impossible! We would know!" The phone in Ava's hand crackled again. The assistant's voice returned, sharper now. "Final confirmation ready, Ms. Moreno. With your verbal approval, the island's deed, along with all associated properties and assets, transfers to your name tonight. The documents are notarized and standing by." A silence so profound, it felt like a physical weight slammed down on the party. Alistair's cane tapped once, twice, an unsteady, feeble sound against the stone. His voice broke when he tried to speak, all the bluster and authority gone. "This is a bluff, a performance." Ava raised the phone back to her ear. Her voice was soft, but it landed like a judge's gavel. "Proceed." Somewhere across the bay, a string of fireworks, scheduled for the Finch family's party, cracked and blossomed in the night sky. But they no longer sounded like a celebration. They sounded like a coronation. The guard who had grabbed her arm took a half step back, then another. The phones kept rolling. And for the first time all evening, the powerful, untouchable Finch family looked smaller than the woman they had so desperately tried to erase. The crowd leaned in, their collective breath held tight as the phone remained pressed to her ear. The assistant's voice came through again, crisp and clear, amplified by the eerie hush that had blanketed the island. "Transaction executed, Ms. Moreno. Effective immediately. All rights of ownership for Osprey's Rest are now under your name. Welcome home." The words detonated like thunder across the calm water. Ava Moreno lifted her chin, her gaze sweeping over Alistair, then Eleanor, then their children, who were still clinging to their wine glasses like life rafts. "You wanted to know who I am," she said, her voice steady, unhurried, each word a perfectly placed nail in the coffin of their arrogance. I am the woman who just bought the ground beneath your feet." Gasps burst like sparks in the night. Guests stumbled back, phones tilting higher, desperate to catch every second of the fallout. Alistair's face drained of all color. His cane tapped twice against the deck, each strike weaker than the last. That's a lie," he stammered. No one buys an island in silence." Her eyes never left his. "Silence," she said, the words slicing clean, "is how power moves when it doesn't need your permission." Eleanor clutched at the pearls around her neck, her voice a trembling whisper that still carried the ghost of a command. "This can't be true. This is our legacy." "No," Ava replied, her voice devoid of triumph, filled only with a quiet finality. "Your legacy was arrogance. Tonight it ends." The guards, the two men who had been her tormentors just moments before, stepped back, their hands falling to their sides. One muttered under his breath, "She really owns it." His partner shot him a panicked glance, but neither of them moved toward her again. Chloe, the young woman in the cashmere wrap, still near the edge of the circle, spoke louder now, emboldened by the sheer weight of the truth. "I knew she didn't belong. Not the way you all said. She belongs because she owns the place." A wave of murmurs broke into applause. It was hesitant at first, then grew stronger, more confident. Guests clapped, some still recording, others simply needing to release the tension, to mark the historic moment. The sound rolled across the patio like a tide the Finch family could no longer hold back. Alistair made one last, pathetic stand. "You can't humiliate us like this. We'll contest it. We'll fight." Her gaze cut him off before her words did. "You don't fight gravity," she said calmly. "And from this moment on, this island falls under mine." Her assistant's voice returned one last time, faint but audible through the speakerphone. "All documents have been logged and verified by the state, Ms. Moreno. You are the sole owner." Eleanor's fingers slipped from her pearls, her hand falling slack against her expensive dress. She whispered, the words barely audible, "It's over." And for the first time that night, the Finch family, so loud, so certain, so cruel, had no words left, only silence. Ava let that silence breathe, let it expand, owning it as surely as she now owned the island itself. The revelation detonated through the party like lightning over the open sea. Conversations fractured into gasps, shouts, and hurried, incredulous whispers. Some guests were now applauding openly, cheering. Others stumbled back in disbelief, their phones shaking in their hands as they tried to capture the raw, unfiltered fallout. Alistair's cane finally slipped from his grasp. He gripped it harder, his knuckles bone-white, but his authority had already crumbled into dust. Eleanor swayed, one jeweled hand flying to her mouth as if to hold back the wave of public humiliation that was crashing over her family. One of their sons, Julian, broke the silence first. "She can't be serious. This is a mistake. It's not possible." His voice cracked halfway through the denial, betraying the truth his words refused to accept. The guards, who had so recently been instruments of the family's will, now stood motionless, their faces pale under the flickering torchlight. One whispered to the other, "She owns the island. We touched her. God help us." Across the crowd, laughter sparked, not the cruel laughter from before, but incredulous, almost gleeful laughter. A man in a seersucker jacket raised his phone higher. "Are you seeing this?" he said to no one in particular. "History just flipped, in real time." Ava remained still, her emerald dress stirring in the night breeze, her silence pressing down heavier than all their noise combined. Then she turned slowly, deliberately, her eyes sweeping across the broken family, one by one. You built this island into a stage for your pride, she said, her tone calm but cutting. And tonight, that stage collapsed under the weight of your own cruelty. Eleanor's face twisted into a mask of rage and shame. You've embarrassed us in front of everyone we know. No, Ava replied, her voice unwavering. You embarrassed yourselves. I simply let the truth stand on its own. Chloe stepped closer into the circle, trembling not with fear, but with the adrenaline of courage. We all saw it. We all heard you. And the world is seeing it now, too. She lifted her phone, its screen glowing with a live stream that was already flooded with thousands of comments. Alistair's mouth fell open. You're recording this? Everyone is, she answered, her voice ringing with conviction. You can't bury this. The family's certainty, the bedrock of their entire existence, cracked like porcelain dropped on a marble floor. Murmurs spread, louder now, less fearful. Guests were no longer whispering behind their hands. They were speaking plainly, openly. She warned them. She stood there, calm, the whole time. They humiliated her on land that she owns. The tide had not just turned, it had become a tsunami. A cousin tried to shout over the rising noise. You're all making a huge mistake siding with her. You'll regret. But the crowd didn't let him finish. The applause broke out again, stronger this time, rolling across the sand and stone like surf. Ava didn't raise her hands. She didn't ask for silence. She just stood there, letting the sound of their downfall wash over the family like a final judgment. For the first time in their coddled, privileged lives, the billionaires looked small, fragile, and utterly lost under the weight of 100 eyes, 100 screens, and one inescapable truth. Ava lifted her phone again, her voice calm, but now edged with iron. Effective immediately, revoke their hosting rights. My team takes control of this island's systems. Now. On the other end, her assistant answered without a fraction of a second's hesitation. Understood. Executing now. A moment later, the guards' radios crackled to life with a voice they didn't recognize. Security detail, stand down. New management protocol has been initiated by the owner. All access systems are being rerouted. Await new directives. The guards exchanged a wide-eyed glance, then slowly, deliberately, lowered their hands. One took a cautious step back from the family, muttering, "She's the owner. We answer to her now." Gasps spread like wildfire. Guests leaned forward, their phones catching every flicker of shock and panic on the Finch family's faces. Eleanor's diamond bracelet slipped down her trembling wrist. This can't be happening. But it was. Alistair swung his cane, which he had shakily retrieved, against the deck in a final act of impotent desperation. You think you can strip us of what is ours? We built this place. Ava's eyes met his, steady and unblinking. You built a monument to your arrogance, she corrected him. I bought the island. Her assistant's voice came through the phone again, sharper this time. Ownership credentials are live. Hosting rights have been revoked. All digital and security systems are now locked to your authority, Ms. Moreno. The effect was immediate and devastating. One of the Finch sons pulled out his phone, scrolling furiously, only to watch his access screen to the island's smart home features blink red. Access denied. Another reached for the electronic control panel near the cabana that managed the lighting and music. Its display faded to black, replaced by a single stark line of white text. Property transfer complete. New owner protocols in effect. Panic, real and visceral, set in. What did she do? She locked us out. This isn't possible. It was possible, more than possible. It was done. It was irreversible. The crowd roared with a mixture of whispers, laughter, and applause. Some guests were openly cheering now. The very same people who had stood by in silence when the humiliation began. Cameras zoomed in on Eleanor's paling face, on Alistair's trembling hand, on their children's looks of utter disbelief. Chloe stepped closer, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "You called her a nobody. You told her she didn't belong, and now she owns the very ground you stand on." The family crumbled under the weight of their own cruelty. Alistair stammered, "We'll sue. We'll fight this." Ava cut him off with words as sharp as glass. "Fight gravity if you wish. The fall is still yours." The guards stood straighter now, turning their backs on the old order to face the new one. Guests clapped harder, some filming in triumph. And the Finch family, once the untouchable sovereigns of their own private kingdom, stood stranded, powerless, on an island that no longer belonged to them. Their downfall was total, it was public, and it was complete. The applause eventually faded into a profound hush, the kind of quiet that comes not from an absence of sound, but from a collective sense of awe. All eyes were fixed on the woman in emerald green as she stood, centered against the torchlight, her presence seeming more permanent than the island itself. She looked at the family, once so loud and powerful, now hollowed out, their eyes darting around for an escape that didn't exist. Their pride had been stripped bare for all to see. Then she spoke, her tone calm, resonant, leaving no room for denial or argument. "You told me I didn't belong here. You mocked my dress. You tried to erase me in front of strangers." She paused, letting each word land like a stone dropped into a deep, still well. "But this island and everything on it now belongs to me." Gasps surged again, followed by a thunderous, rolling wave of applause. Guests rose to their feet, clapping, shouting, some even whistling. Phones captured every angle of the drama, every tear of disbelief streaking down the faces of the fallen family. Eleanor staggered a step backward, whispering to no one in particular, "It's over." Alistair's cane slipped from his numb fingers again, clattering uselessly against the deck. This time he didn't even bother to pick it up. The guards no longer looked at the family for instruction. Their eyes were fixed on Ava, awaiting their new orders. The taller one asked quietly, his voice filled with respect, "What would you like us to do, ma'am?" She didn't hesitate. "Escort them to the docks. Their boat is waiting. They forfeited their right to stand on this ground the moment they tried to deny me mine." Cheers erupted as the guards moved, not to drag her out, but to usher the billionaires from the stage they had once so arrogantly commanded. Phones followed their every step, recording the precise moment that entitlement was dethroned in front of its own court. Chloe, tears of catharsis bright in her eyes, clapped harder than anyone. "Justice," she whispered to Liam. "This is what justice looks like." Ava turned, her gaze sweeping over the crowd of witnesses. The applause softened, giving her the space to speak one last time. "I don't need cameras to prove what happened here tonight," she said, her voice carrying a profound weight. "And I don't need your applause. I stand here as living proof. I am not the story you tried to write for me. I am the ending you never saw coming." Her words echoed across the stone and out over the dark water. Guests nodded, some wiping at their own faces, others still capturing every second for the world that existed beyond this island. She stepped forward, her emerald dress seeming to glow in the torchlight, her voice final and absolute. "You see, tonight was never about buying an island. It was about reclaiming a piece of a world that tells people like me, every single day, that we are not enough. It was about proving that dignity is not a privilege to be granted by the wealthy, but a right that is owned by all. And worth is not measured by the label on your dress, but by the strength of your spirit. I don't need to record injustice, she concluded, her voice ringing with the force of an unbreakable truth. I am the result of it, and that is why you will never, ever erase me again. The crowd erupted one last time, a roar of triumph that drowned out the sound of the surf. Phones were lifted higher. Applause turned into cheers. The Finch family vanished into the shadows, escorted away on the very soil they once claimed as their own. And in the center of it all, the woman in the emerald green dress stood unshaken, silent, powerful, and radiant. Not a guest, not a trespasser. The owner, the embodiment of dignity transformed into power. The night closed in around her, but the moment would never fade. It was carved into 100 digital memories, broadcast to a waiting world. Humiliation had been flipped into sovereignty. Justice had not needed to shout. It had simply arrived quietly and claimed what was rightfully hers. What a story. It just goes to show you that the quietest person in the room is often the most powerful. Thank you for being here with us tonight, for being a witness. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let me know in the comments. What's the biggest lesson you're taking away from Ava's story? Until next time, stand your ground.